The first presentation is going to be given by Doctors West-Barnette and Srinivasan, going to be covering modified oils, safety evaluations of GRAS food ingredients, and also bioengineered plants. And these two are doing a what we call a tag team. And so one will lead right into the other. So I'm going to turn the mic over first to Dr. West-Barnette, and then she will turn it over to Dr. Srinivasan.
Milk, orange juice, and even infant formulas. Today's marketplace offers a variety of foods to which oils with modified fatty acid profiles are added as ingredients for their known health benefits. I'll discuss how FDA evaluates the safety of these modified oils when they're used as food ingredients. Dr. Srinivasan will discuss how FDA evaluates the safety of bioengineered plant varieties that produce oils with modified fatty acid profiles. In discussing the safety evaluations of oils used as food ingredients, I'll focus on oils that contain eicosapentaenoic acid, or EPA, and docosahexaenoic acid, or DHA. I'll briefly discuss the food sources of EPA and DHA and the evidence for health benefits of consuming these foods. I'll show examples of products that contain EPA and DHA as added food ingredients. I'll discuss two of the regulatory categories for food ingredients and how FDA evaluates the safety of food ingredients with emphasis on GRAS food ingredients. I'll then walk you through an evaluation of a recent GRAS notice for an EPA-rich oil intended to be used as a food ingredient. What I'm showing here are data provided in a published study in which the percentages of EPA, DHA, and other fatty acids were measured. Highlighted are the percentages of EPA and DHA in meat and poultry products, cereals, and fish and seafood products. You'll see that in comparison to meat and poultry products and cereals and the other product categories that are listed, fish and seafood are by far the best source of EPA and DHA. Due to the high EPA and DHA content of fish and seafood, the United States Department of Agriculture and Department of Health and Human Services dietary guidelines for Americans recommend that people consume about 8 ounces of seafood per week, which provides an average consumption of 250 milligrams per day of EPA and DHA. Consumption at this level is associated with reduced heart disease and improved fetal and infant development. However, even with these described health benefits, many Americans only consume a mean intake of about 3.5 ounces of seafood per week, which means that most of us aren't consuming enough EPA and DHA from these sources. Therefore, to provide consumers with alternative food choices that contain EPA and DHA, many manufacturers are marketing food products to which oils containing EPA and DHA are added as food ingredients. Milk, orange juice, and infant formula are just a few examples of food products to which oils containing EPA and DHA are added as ingredients. I'll now discuss how FDA evaluates the safety of food ingredients. But first, a trivia question. One category of food ingredients that FDA evaluates is ingredients whose uses are GRAS. Before I continue, let's see how many of you know what GRAS is. Is GRAS an acronym for Generally Recorded and Scientific, Generally Registered as Safe, Generally Recognized as Safe, or Good Reason to Add Stuff? I'll provide the answer in just a minute. Earlier, Barbara Schneeman discussed the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, otherwise known as the Act. Under the Act, any substance that is directly or indirectly added to food is a food additive. Food additives require the submission of a petition to FDA. The food additive petition must be reviewed and approved by FDA before the food additive can be legally marketed. The data and information that support the safety of the use of a food additive may be proprietary. If, after evaluation of a food additive petition, FDA determines that the use of a food additive is safe, FDA issues a regulation defining the chemical identity, specifications, use, and limitations of use for the food additive. Again, each of these criteria describe food additives. However, under the Act, there is an exemption from the requirements of pre-market approval. That exemption is a food ingredient whose use is generally recognized as safe, or GRAS. So those of you who answered option C, generally recognized as safe, were correct. Unlike food additives, an ingredient whose use is GRAS does not require pre-market review and approval by FDA. FDA's GRAS program currently operates under a proposed rule and is voluntary. Therefore, a manufacturer must determine that the use of an ingredient is GRAS, but they may choose whether to notify FDA of their GRAS determination. Regardless of whether they participate in FDA's GRAS program, manufacturers of ingredients whose uses are GRAS must have safety data and information for their food ingredients. These data and information must be generally available to the public and ordinarily are published in the scientific literature. There also must be a basis to conclude that qualified experts are in agreement about the safe use of a GRAS ingredient. I'll emphasize here that the general availability and general scientific consensus of safety data are the hallmarks that distinguish GRAS food ingredient uses from food additive uses. But the quality and quantity of safety data and information is the same for both food additives and GRAS substances. While there may be differences in the availability of data and information needed to prove safety, again, the quality and quantity of safety data and information are the same for GRAS substances and food additives. After evaluation of a GRAS notice, if FDA has no questions regarding the safety of a food ingredient use that a manufacturer considers to be GRAS, FDA issues a no questions letter for the use of that GRAS food ingredient. Guidance documents about safety or about submission of food additive petitions and GRAS notices is available on FDA's website. Summarized here are the GRAS notices for oils that FDA has evaluated and responded to with no questions letters. We received GRAS notices for oils derived from a variety of sources, including fish and plants. Some manufacturers produce oils using microbial sources, which they consider to be more sustainable than sources such as fish. Some of these microbial sources are genetically modified to produce the desired oils. What I'll do now is walk you through the evaluation of one of these GRAS notices to give you an idea of the type of safety data and information that FDA evaluates. This exercise should give you an idea of how FDA decides whether or not we have questions about the safe use of an ingredient whose use is GRAS. This exercise is not intended to be an endorsement or an advertisement of the subject ingredient and is only meant to serve as a representative example. FDA evaluated GRAS Notice 355 for EPA-rich triglyceride oil from the yeast Yersinia lipolytica, which was engineered to produce the oil, genetically modified to produce the oil. The notifier determined that the EPA-rich oil from Y. lipolytica is GRAS for use in several food categories at a maximum use level of 4.32%. The notifier estimated that the maximum intake level of the EPA-rich oil from the intended uses would be 3 grams per day EPA, not to be combined or augmented with any other food ingredient containing EPA or DHA. Let's take a look at the data and information that the notifier submitted to FDA in support of their GRAS determination for EPA-rich oil. First, another trivia question. Under the Act, FDA has the authority to determine whether a food ingredient is beneficial. Is this true or false? I'll give you the answer in just a minute. The data and information The data and information that manufacturers submit to FDA in support of their GRAS determinations can be thought of as pieces of a puzzle. When put together, these pieces should provide a whole picture that speaks to the safety of a GRAS food ingredient use. Let's take a look at the pieces that make up the GRAS picture of the EPA-rich oil. The first piece to be considered is the source of the EPA-rich oil. Food ingredients such as EPA-rich oil have to be derived from a safe source, and FDA evaluated information that the notifier submitted about the safety of the source for EPA-rich oil, the yeast Y. lipolytica. Key to this discussion is information about how the source was identified, and the notifier submitted information about how Y. lipolytica was verified. Organisms that are sources of food ingredients should not cause disease in healthy people and should not produce harmful substances. The notifier submitted information that discussed how Y. lipolytica meets these two criteria. I mentioned earlier that Y. lipolytica was engineered genetically to produce EPA-rich oil. When genetically modified organisms are used as food ingredient sources, all sources of DNA sequences used in modifying the organism have to be should be characterized and discussed. The notifier discussed the DNA sequences that were introduced into Y. lipolytica to make the microbe produce EPA-rich oil. Another important consideration is whether Y. lipolytica or parts of the yeast are expected to be a component of the final product or the EPA-rich oil. The notifier stated that the microbe is not part of the EPA-rich oil ingredient. Since the source of a food ingredient is the starting material that's used to manufacture the finished product, the safety of the source goes hand in hand with consideration of the method of manufacture of a food ingredient. In discussing the manufacture of EPA-rich oil, the notifier provided information describing the composition of the finished product. Along with the discussion of composition, the notifier provided an analysis confirming that the ingredient complies with specifications. Specifications include descriptions of the components of a specific ingredient. For EPA-rich oil, the notifier discussed the fatty acid profile of the oil, as well as limits for impurities or contaminants, such as microbes. The law requires that the food be manufactured according to current good manufacturing practices for foods, and the notifier discussed that EPA-rich oil is manufactured in compliance with the law. The next piece of the puzzle is exposure, or understanding how much of a food ingredient consumers will eat. Evaluation of exposure to a food ingredient, such as EPA-rich oil, involves understanding the intended foods to which the ingredient will be added, how much of the ingredient will be added to those foods, and what the estimated dietary intake of the ingredient will be. The notifier provided answers to all of these questions in its submission. The final and critical piece of the GRAS puzzle is comprised of safety data and information for the food ingredient, or for the intended use of the food ingredient. In order for the use of a food ingredient to be GRAS, safety studies for a food ingredient must be appropriately designed, which means they must be appropriately controlled and support the safety of the food ingredient at the manufacturer's intended use levels. In some cases, manufacturers submit studies that discuss the health benefits of certain food ingredients. However, FDA's authority under the Act is to evaluate the safety of food ingredients and not the health benefits of food ingredients. Therefore, only the data and information related to the safety of the food ingredient are considered during the evaluation of a GRAS notice. Therefore, those of you who answered false to the statement under the Act, FDA has authority to determine whether a food ingredient is beneficial or correct. It's important to remember that the safety data and information for a GRAS food ingredient must be publicly available, and support consensus by qualified experts. the notifier submitted a discussion of safety studies conducted in animals to demonstrate the safety of the use of EPA-rich oil when consumed at the intended use levels. These safety studies were published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, which demonstrated the general availability and scientific consensus that is needed for the use of a food ingredient to be considered GRAS. All puzzle pieces being adequately addressed and assembled, FDA's evaluation of the notifier's GRAS determination led to the agency issuing a no questions response letter to the manufacturer last year. In closing, FDA has evaluated several GRAS notices for oils containing EPA and DHA. These GRAS notices described the intended uses of the oils as food ingredients. During our evaluations of these GRAS notices, FDA has considered the safety of the sources of the oils, the method of manufacture, the exposure, and safety data and information for the oils. Thanks for your attention to the first part of this discussion, and I'll now turn things over to Dr. Srinivasan.
Everyone, my name is Jannavi Srinivasan. I work as a review chemist in the Office of Food Additive Safety in the Division of Biotechnology and GRAS Notice Review. You heard about the evaluation of GRAS ingredients, their safety, by Dr. West-Barnette. We'll shift gears here a little and discuss another program within the Office of Food Additive Safety. This is the Voluntary Consultation Program for foods from bioengineered plants at the FDA. You might have heard of foods from bioengineered plants referred to as genetically modified, genetically engineered plants, or GMOs. For this talk, I will refer to these as bioengineered foods. In 1986, the United States government established the coordinated framework giving authority to 3 government agencies over bioengineered crops. The USDA oversees safety of the cultivation of the new varieties. EPA regulates the food and environmental safety of pesticides, including pesticides introduced into plant via biotechnology. FDA's authority is to ensure that the foods and feed from bioengineered plants are safe to eat and addresses any food labeling issues. So in the following slides, I will discuss aspects of safety governed by policy and show you an example of safety review in the context of modified oils from plants. Here's a quiz question. Crops are genetically engineered. Are they for nutritional purposes, for pest resistance, for herbicide tolerance, or for any or all of the above? I will get back to the answer to this question in a couple of slides. So in 1992, FDA published a policy statement explaining how it would regulate foods from new plant varieties. Plants can be bioengineered for a variety of reasons. It can include nutritional purposes, herbicide tolerance, pest resistance, or all of them. The 1992 policy statement applies to all new plant varieties and not just bioengineered varieties. This is because FDA has the same safety standards for food and feed, whether they are made from bioengineered or conventionally bred crop. The 1992 policy makes it clear that the safety of foods from new plant varieties must be comparable to conventional food. So, for example, a bioengineered tomato must have the same safety standards as a conventionally bred tomato. The policy statement did not make any new law, but in fact explained how it would rely on existing laws to regulate bioengineered foods. The policy states that FDA has authority over the safety and labeling of foods and feed from bioengineered crop based on the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or the FD&C Act. This is the same law that gives FDA the authority to regulate safety and labeling of all foods. The 1992 policy relies on 2 provisions within the Act for the regulation of bioengineered foods. They are the food adulteration provision and the food additive provision. According to the food adulteration provision, FDA has authority on any substance added to food that is harmful or injurious to health. For example, solanine is a naturally occurring toxicant in potato. Increased levels of solanine in potato can be considered harmful to health and may therefore be illegal. This would apply equally for a bioengineered potato as well as from a potato grown from conventional crop. The second provision, food additive provision, establishes that FDA can require pre-market approval of any substance added to food that is not generally recognized as safe, or GRAS, as Dr. West-Barnette just spoke with you earlier about. For example, a new protein made by a bioengineered plant is a food additive unless it's GRAS. So back to the answers to the poll question. Crops are altered via bioengineering for, if you answer D, for any or all of the above. Everybody answered right. Moving along. So this policy statement also explains that the safety assessment is multidisciplinary in that it should include agronomic and quality characteristics as well as genetic, compositional, and nutritional analyses. So when looking at safety of the new variety, FDA experts consider issues such as identity of the protein, including structure and function, source of DNA making the protein, if this is coming from a known allergen or a pathogen, potential toxicity and allergenicity of the substance, the dietary exposure, as in if the substance will be a major constituent in the diet and if the substance will have any nutritional implication. In the specific case of a new plant variety grown for a new or modified oil, safety assessment should be made based on its composition and the presence of any unusual components at levels that would cause a safety concern. One could apply a decision tree approach when looking at a new plant variety capable of producing new or modified fats or oils, such as the one shown here. Such a decision tree approach also exists for assessing the safety of the host plant, safety of the donor plant, newly introduced proteins, and new or modified carbohydrates. I'd like to now discuss a specific example of a biotech notification for a new canola variety submitted to FDA for safety review. We call such files BNF within the FDA when they come in. This biotech notification file I'm discussing is BNF number 25. It was for a canola variety that was modified to produce increased levels of lauric and myristic acids in the seed oil by expression of the enzyme 12-0-acyl carrier protein thioesterase from California Bay. As guided by the 1992 policy statement, the safety assessment of this new canola variety in BNF 25 involved a thorough review of the safety of the introduced genetic material, the identity and function of expression products encoded by this inserted material, safety of the protein that was introduced, and compositional analysis. This would include any toxicants, nutrients, and anti-nutrients that a canola plant would have, as well as the oil, the high laurate canola oil nutrition itself. Specifically, this slide here is meant to demonstrate the concentration of the levels of lauric acid as a % fatty acid in the new canola variety as compared to the conventionally bred canola varieties. This brings us to a very important slide, which is labeling. To go back to the 1992 policy statement, there are no established special labeling requirements for bioengineered foods as a class of foods in that policy statement. It only states that FDA has no basis for concluding that bioengineered foods differ from other foods in any meaningful or uniform way, or that as a class, foods developed by new techniques present any different or greater safety concern than foods developed by traditional plant breeding. Per the FD&C Act, labeling must be truthful and not misleading. Foods, including bioengineered foods, must be labeled only when there is a significant change in one of the following: nutritional, compositional change, or if there is a change in conditions of use, or when an allergenic component has been introduced in a food where it does not naturally occur. These would trigger a labeling requirement. So in the case of BNF 25 producing high low rate canola, the oil produced from this crop variety had lower oleic acid levels and than the standards of identity, namely canola oil. This new plant variety also had higher lauric and myristic acid levels than what is called canola oil for a standard. The notifying company proposed to FDA that the common or usual name for the oil from this new plant variety would therefore be called low-rate canola oil in order to differentiate it from the standards of identity for canola oil. Here's another quick question. A genetically engineered crop requires a label if it has substantially different characteristics from the conventional crop, or if it has substantially equivalent characteristics from the conventional crop. Hopefully you would have had the answer in listening to the previous couple parts of this presentation. Coming to the summary, the Biotech Notification Program assesses the safety of foods from new plant varieties. The safety standard for such foods is the same as that for foods from conventionally bred crops. FDA has established voluntary consultation procedures whereby developers can submit their summaries of safety and nutritional data for review. The end goal of this voluntary consultation procedure is guided by the 1992 policy and is for active resolution of safety and regulatory issues prior to the commercialization of the bioengineered food. I think most of you got it right. A genetically engineered crop requires labeling only if it has substantially different characteristics from the conventional crop. I want to take a minute to thank you all and also acknowledge our colleagues. This is both on behalf of Dr. West-Barnette and myself, colleagues in the Office of Food Additive Safety for helping us with this presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Srinivasan and Dr. West-Barnette. We have time for maybe one question while our next speaker comes forward. I see that there are quite a few questions. Let's see if we can scroll back to the very beginning questions. Just as some people are asking about the presentation, these are going to be these are being recorded. They will be available on the JIFSAN website. So there's I'm trying to make sure I get to the first question. The first one that I see, and forgive me if I missed your question because we only have time for one, is there testing to determine if tests performed on standard grown tomato is actually discovering a dangerous or unhealthy anomaly? And I think that's a biotechnology question. I don't know, about that testing, And then there's a question directly, specifically to Dr. West-Barnette, mentioned that FDA approves an engineered yeast as a source of the EPA oil. What about approved sources of DHA? We can't answer that one.
Just to quickly answer the question about approving the source of EPA, I'll start off by saying to be careful that we didn't approve the source of the EPA. The EPA itself was the subject of a GRAS notice, and the GRAS food ingredient uses don't require approval. So when we issue a response, it's a no questions response, which isn't quite the same as an approval when you're thinking about the difference between GRAS ingredients and food additive petitions. We have seen, I think we have evaluated some GRAS notices for DHA, where DHA was derived from different sources. I can't think of which one it is right now, but just But it's available on our website. We do have an inventory of all the GRAS notices that we've evaluated on our website, so that may be a place to start if you're looking for information about the EPA and DHA GRAS notices.
All right, thank you very much, and we're moving on to our next presentation.